Hello and welcome. My name is Ben Kickert, and today's presentation is entitled A Computational Approach to Daily Life, Utilizing Wolfram Tools Outside of Work. To give you an overview of what we're going to cover in today's presentation, I want to start by talking a little bit about some of the projects that I work on in more of a professional role. Then I want to discuss in general the idea of what is computational living and what overlaps does it create between our personal and our private lives. The bulk of our presentation today is actually going to be more of a technical overview of some of the projects that we've worked on that are complementary between our more professional life and our personal life. The three technical aspects that we're going to talk about is how we can use data from an app used to rate and respond to beers that you've tasted, and how we can create AI tools to work with that. The second technical area is going to be on Wolfram Cloud functionality. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how I've integrated that into a tool that I use to track allowances and spending for my children. And finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about web session, how it can be used both for a work environment and also personally for things like being able to collect and understand product data. So the projects or the initiatives that I spend most of my coding time on are called SDGCounting and Starting Up Good. These are both two initiatives that are supported by a very small team of data and development professionals. And our work is generally related to advocacy, data analytics, pro bono partnership. SDGCounting has a mission of tracking the Sustainable Development Goals and a particular focus on how that impact is being tracked and how the data is being shared. Starting Up Good is an initiative that advocates for startups to include social and environmental impact objectives in their business plans, and also to provide support to young businesses as they grow and develop, and to encourage impact investing. And so we've talked about our work in those initiatives in previous conferences. And so today we want to talk about how those same tools have worked their way into my daily life. So let's start by asking, what is computational living? In short, computational living is simply approaching life, understanding daily questions and problems with the expectation that more informed decisions are possible. That's to say that when we look at a situation, we know that there are ways that we can better understand the world around us and can respond to that. Computational living is also about that symbiotic relationship between personal and professional lives, where we find that novel insights are provided both from our personal lives and the things that we are passionate about, and those can inform our coding and our analytics and the work that we do, and vice versa, the things that we do in the office can also be applied to our personal lives. When I think of computational living, I actually think of some of my favorite presentations so far at these technology conferences. I find that the presentations that are most captivating for me are the ones that are on the personal side, that are the side projects that Wolfram staff or other presenters have been working on, because I think that passion drives a lot of innovation. So what we want to do is we want to see ways that we've seen that, or I've seen that in my own experience from working on the SDGs and impact investing, and how that's trickled into more mundane or personal things. So from the technical side, let's actually start with machine learning and what we've done for development data and how that relates to something like product preferences. This is actually an area where our work is very well documented. I have several links here in the notebook, and just as an aside, the notebook is uploaded. Any code that I skim over, you'll be able to understand a little bit better or dig a little bit more into there. But we've in previous sessions, we've talked about doing analytics on public data to get things that aren't included in reports. We've talked about how you can work with diverse data sets and how we can take that and build it into a machine learning algorithm. We've talked about how you can work with unstructured data. We're actually going to continue that conversation immediately after this session. We've got another one where we're talking about PDFs and videos, among other things. But generally, those methodologies have helped us do the work of advocacy and support. But the same tools can actually help us understand other things that are a bit more nuanced. In this case, it can help me understand beer. Now, something to know about me. I'm recently, or relatively recently, repatriated to the United States after spending 7 years living in Southern Africa. And during my time in Southern Africa, and Swaziland in particular, I didn't have access to a lot of variety of beer. And so when I moved to back to the United States, we ended up in Asheville, North Carolina, which has 90 breweries within an hour of us. So it was a bit overwhelming to try to understand and remember what was it that I liked. So I turned to an app called Untapped, which allows you, if you try something new, to say, this is what I think of it, this is the rating, here are some notes on it. And at the end of my first year, I had recorded data on over 500 different beers that I had tried or purchased. And so looking at that and looking at the information in the structured data that was available to me, what I wanted to be able to do is to have a more in-depth analysis of what I'm interested in so that I can understand my preferences better. But more importantly, I wanted to be able to create an online web app that would allow me to predict before I had it whether or not I would like a beer. And so at the end of the day, that's what my final product was a beer rating predictor. So looking at the code, relatively straightforward. You can download the CSV from Untapped, turn that into a data set. Looking at the data set, we can see things such as beer names, brewery names. All of this is auto-populated. We can find out about the alcohol by volume, the IBUs. It includes lat and long about places that you have checked in. And so I'm already starting off simply by putting in a rating and some notes. I'm already getting a lot of additional data that's being given to me. So the next step is basically to take some of that data and reformat it. We take the way that they had structured their beer types and subtypes and split that off. We take their latitude and longitude data, turn that into geopositions so that we can plot it later. And then we fill out the rest of our data set. So since we started with geodata, again, simply from a few lines of code and downloading a CSV, we're able to create some geographics about places that I checked in different beers. So the first year that I was back in the States, you can see I had a beer in Ethiopia, a couple in Europe, and a few across the United States. In Asheville, I made sure in my first year that I tried as many different locations as possible. So we were able to visualize that. Although I was also interested in finding out where were the beers from that I had tried. This information was simply included as a city and state. So it didn't have the latitude and longitude. And so in order to figure out a way to get that data, I was able to use the interpreter, the city interpreter, and simply feed the information about the brewery, city, state, and country into it, and then create a different visualization of where all the beers are that I'm from. And so since a lot of what I had were microbrews and were local, you can see that there's a strong representation on the East Coast. So that's kind of a quick and dirty way to show some information about what I had been drinking in a year. But I actually wanted to understand a little bit more about my preferences. Did my scores match up with what I was actually thought that I was interested in? So one of the easiest and quantifiable ways that I could think of was actually to look at the alcohol by volume of the beers that I had. And generally, I like a more full, flavorful beer, which tends to be on the higher alcohol level. And so when I ran this scatter plot for ABV ratings and trends, we see that that's pretty clearly indicated that just because a beer is low ABV doesn't mean that I'll hate it. But if a beer is high ABV, it's probably going to be on the higher side. And so this matches up with what I thought. And this is kind of my first tangent about how the work that we do in our personal lives can inform the work we do in our professional lives. I find that when I'm starting a new project or I'm trying a new implementation, oftentimes I want to start with a data set that I'm very familiar with. That way I can make sure that the outputs are actually in line with what I'm expecting. And so I intrinsically know what styles of beer I tend to gravitate towards. And so looking at something like this, I can say, yes, this does match with my expectations. If it had been reversed, I would have had to go back and check it. So I can say that in our professional work, there have been a lot of times where I've piloted ideas by looking first at something that I know a little bit better. We can also look at IBU ratings. I mean, this is just scratching the surface. Being as prone as I am to go overboard on these things, I ended up with probably a 20 or 30 page notebook that looked at everything from the prevalence of the styles, my preferences of styles, most common breweries, quantifying geographic distribution, timeline trends, common characteristics in my top rated beer, and word trends. And the truth is that I actually ended up with way more than that I could explore, and I didn't actually have a chance to. But the end goal of taking this information was that I wanted to be able to create a predictor. And this is a straightforward enough data set that by pulling in a few known variables and threading them to the score that I gave them, it's quite easy to be able to create a set of AI training data. So here we're bringing in brewery name, the ABV, which is the alcohol, the IBU, which is how bitter or hoppy it is, and then the style of beer, and threading that to the score. We can then do a training data set as well as a test data set. And because this is straightforward in essentially one line of code, we can simply say predict on this training data and give me the highest quality performance as you can. We get the predictor out, and when we run our predictor measurements through it, we see that in general, it does line up. There's definitely a trend to squash things more towards the mean. And so something that is rated as a high beer might be even higher than what the predictor will give, a low beer lower than what the predictor would give. But again, this is something I can visualize and know. I can test it out and check it. And at the end of the day, we have this beer rating predictor that now we keep on the website. My wife uses it if she's doing the shopping for that week and wants to know whether or not there's something that I would like. So again, these are all tools that we developed on a professional side, talking about sustainable development and talking about working with startups, and those processes and methodologies we were able to bring back and look at more of a personal side. So the next project that we saw this overlap is when we start talking about scheduled tasks, online forms, cloud data storage, and how that applies both to technical research as well as our family financial tools. So not long after we moved back to the United States, my kids realized that their peers were getting an allowance. So they came to me and said, "Hey, Daddy, we want an allowance too." It seemed like a relatively good idea, so we said yes. But I never carry cash on me anymore, and so I wanted to have a tool that I could use that would not be as hands-on. And so I set a couple ideas of what my design requirements were. I said that I wanted something that would automatically handle weekly deposits because I don't carry cash. I wanted it to have a web interface where my wife and I can make adjustments, but also a tool where kids can track their own status so they can see how much money they have in savings. And most importantly, all the data must be persistent and cloud-based. And because of some of the work that we had done on creating online forms to match startups to potential funders, that also used AI, some online forms and data bins related to COVID data and providing localized quantifiable trends, looking at some of the automated Twitter reports and Twitter bots that we've created. All of those things, I was able to, in 15 minutes, come up with what this tool is. If this is something you're interested in, the code that I used is below. I'll go ahead and tell you that this is not the live version, so you're not going to be messing with my kids' allowance if you go to the link. But first, we create a data bin. And then we create a change form. This is where my wife and I can add money, subtract money. If kids help around the house, we'll give them a few extra bucks. Forget to make their bed, we can take some money off. But probably the most interesting for me has actually been the allowance balance check. And the reason I say that is because it has allowed my kids to be more hands-on with their own financial situation, where if they had money in their cookie jar on the dresser, they might not pay attention to it or might not know how much is in there. But just the other day, my son wanted to buy Pokemon cards. He pulled this form up on his tablet. He saw how much money he had. He realized that that was going to be a pretty big hit, and he's like, "Nope, I really want the Pokemon cards." So he did it. So using tools like this is a way not only to simplify my life, but also it's ended up being a useful tool for my kids. Finally, and again, we've got the code iconized here, but we created a scheduled task that automatically adds $10 per week. So again, this is an area where we piloted a lot of these ideas in our professional life, but because thinking about things in a computational way, we were able to easily transition that into something personal and something that's useful, and in this case, very something that I've been passionate about as I see how my kids have responded to it. Okay, last thing, and I'm gonna skim over this one a bit. I want to talk a bit about how we've used Web Session. The reason that I mention Web Session is because we have consistently found as a team that Web Session is one of the most powerful and frequently used tools in our arsenal for collecting data. We have access to a lot of things from PDFs to JSON databases that we can download to SQL databases, a lot of things that we can use, but there's a lot of information that gets presented in a website that is structured enough to be able to pull down, but is not something that we're able to to access and download in a pre-formatted way. And so in our work, we've used this for business databases and investor databases. We've converted bad tables into good tables. We found links for PDFs and media. We've looked at country data from government websites. And this is something that because it's been so integrated into my work on a personal level, Web Session has also become my own go-to tool. If I open up ESPN and I'm looking at cricket scores and I want to be able to quantify that in a new way, my first thought is how can I scrape this in Web Session to be able to analyze it. So a quick example of how I've used it within the last 2 months is I've recently gotten into tenkara fishing, which is a Japanese style of fishing that is only recently becoming more popular in the US. So a lot of equipment and a lot of gear and a lot of the materials are only in Japanese, and I don't read Japanese. But I was able to find a really good website called Tenkara Bum that listed a lot of Japanese fishing rods that I couldn't find information on in other places. And so I wanted to be able to take what he had as product pages, be able to put it into a table so that I could start making comparisons and make a decision on what I might want to log on to Japanese Amazon for and have them sent to it. So just to quickly show the process, and before I do, let me emphasize that anything with Web Session is almost always going to be bespoke. There's almost always a need to customize it based on the coding styles or the content management system behind the scenes. But what I can say is that the one line of code that I so wish was better documented from Wolfram's side is the ability to pull an attribute from a tag or from an element that's been used. So I've included this in previous presentations because I think that it's so useful. I literally use it weekly. But this get attribute function allows you to say, hey, find a link and send me back the href, or find me a division and send me back the ID. So it's something that allows you to get more information than what stock Web Session would allow, or Web Execute. So once we open up his product pages, we can download all the links to the individual products, and then open the first one and start trying to decipher the CSS to figure out how should things be structured. And so here I'm pulling everything in as a key and a value. So we've got the name of the rod. I then look at the way the designer has structured the description. I can pull that information in, continue on, and I see that there's a lot of details. And this is something that's not consistent. So this is where there's a little bit more thinking through the process. I want to know the information about the length and the collapse length, the weight. Pennies is a measurement of how stiff it is. At the same time, I found that the designer himself actually changed his format a couple different ways. So I had to write some additional code to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, all of it could be included in a, let me iconize that, in a, whoops, it doesn't like me, in a single code that all I had to do is feed the links back through. Once that was done, put everything back into a database, and now I have all the information in front of me. So as I said, when I think about the work that's happening on the web and ways that data is being presented in a way that is needed, this is often a stopgap measure when you don't have clean data as a way to be able to bring things into process. A couple keys to success, having used this almost since it launched a couple years ago. I remember listening to the live CEO sessions as they were talking about it. But a couple things we've learned in that process. First off, and I've mentioned this before, is to always approach every website fresh. Don't expect a approach that you used on one website to work on another website, even if it's the same domain. Second, and I think that most people are probably already at this level, but there's definitely a need to brush up on your HTML and CSS. It's not that you need to be at a production level, but when you're trying to decipher what selectors to use, being able to understand the way that CSS and HTML work is going to be essential. The same thing is true with the JavaScript, which admittedly I'm not great at, but using JavaScript execute, we've been able to automatically scroll screens so that Ajax loaded content will continue to populate so that we can pull all of it in at once. We've used it to reveal hidden elements before. The other thing I would say is to pay attention not only to the text, but also to the attributes of what you're trying to scrape. Many times you find that there's additional data contained in the class or in the ID name that's relevant, but it's not going to be publicly displayed. I don't know if you have followed the news recently, but I think it was Missouri where a reporter found that the teacher database had actually included the social security numbers as the IDs for a table that they had listed. And so it was a case where the reporter was accused of hacking when in fact he was simply gaining information that was made public, even if it wasn't visible. The other tip, and this is one we've kind of learned the hard way, is it's often easier to import larger strings and manipulate them after scraping than it is to import every element at the same time. So for instance, if you have a table, you can pull in every table data cell and then partition it to be able to get what you need. However, if you pull in the table row and you have another way to partition, that's going to increase the speed at which this functions. And so in a case where you're running, 500, 1,000, 2,000 links, every second counts. And so doing it that way, you can use things such as string split, string trim, partition, part to be able to work through that. Next, I would say be sure to test your initial approaches on multiple examples. I can't tell you how many times I have started a session, thought that I had good code, ran it on 100, and then realized that the formatting changed, or what I thought was always going to be the third part ended up not being there. And finally, I would say, again, this one was learned a hard way. Consider approaches that store each entity or each entry into a local file instead of trusting the entire evaluation to complete and provide a final output. We've had cases where we've had 8-hour sessions where the computer is running and constantly pulling up these websites. And at the end of the day, I lose internet connection and all of that calculation is gone. So we've actually started including that. All right, and just to kind of wrap it up in terms of what our next steps are, and then I'll take a look at the questions. For us, the next steps, or for me, the next steps are to encourage organic flow between the professional tools and the personal passions. That's in my day-to-day life. That's thinking about ways that projects I'm working on at the office can be applied to problems that I'm facing at home. And likewise, thinking about the side projects I have that I'm passionate about may be able to advance the goals of the work that I do. Second, my goal or my next step is to engage the Wolfram community to make sure I'm sharing code and also making sure I'm reading that to be inspired to learn different ways. And so we've been very intentional about making sure that our code is available whenever possible. Even though we flew through it, if anybody wants to recreate what we've done, all of that is going to be in the document it's available for download here. And the third, on kind of a more personal and work-related area, is that we want to explore video and PDF processing even more. Every year we've advanced a little bit, but we feel like with the developments that we're seeing in Wolfram and the Wolfram language, now is a time where that's really going to, we're going to see incremental growth. And just as a shameless plug, I'm going to have to jump out of here quickly because right after this, the 4 o'clock session, Maureen and I are doing another session on SDG metrics from PDF and videos and images. So if you're available and you'd like to join us there, we'll have a bit more of a technical discussion at that time. So before I look at the questions, I've included my email at the end of this document. Feel free to email me anything that I'm not able to cover. Again, I'm happy to send you some of the code that I've used and things that I've referenced, and we'll go from there. So let's see what we have here. From Amy, dude, avoid lemon space dog. I agree. That is a local Asheville beer that I'm sure did not score well on my side. And it looks like there's a question from Rodrigo, or a comment from Rodrigo, about web execute in the Wolfram Cloud. And we agree, that's something that we've seen as being a limitation. We have a lot of tools that we've developed locally that require you to open a web session, scrape data, and then respond to it. Things with Twitter, things with Bing search, and Bing news articles come to mind, and including that with Azure. Unfortunately, that can't be done because we can't cloud deploy it. And so, yes, let's continue to advocate for that. And thanks in general for all of the kind words and comments. So I will wrap it up there, unless there's anything else. But if not, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I hope in your own personal and professional life, you find that synergy that makes both of them better. Thank you so much.